Chapter 7. The two pursuers stopped as they turned the corner. John had disappeared completely into thin air. The male slowly walked down the road, searching for any trace of the kid, whilst the female shouldered her assault rifle and covered her companion as he checked. Both of them moved in total silence, their feet hardly making a sound as they carefully crept down the road, their heads swiveling left and right as they passed the decrepit houses on either side of them. There was no sign of him whatsoever. The female opened up her pack and took out a pair of infrared night vision goggles and looked at each house, spotting no heat signatures whatsoever aside from her companion. Even behind the walls, she should have been able to see some kind of heat in such a bleak and cold night. Where the hell's he gone? She pulled the goggles up to her forehead and huffed a sigh of annoyance. Her companion turned back to her and shook his head. Great, we fucking lost him. She snapped out a sidekick and tore the wing mirror off a rusted car with her booted foot to vent her frustration, sending it skittering down the pavement with a clatter. Calm down, he told her evenly. We'll find him. He could be anywhere by now. She kicked the side of the car's door and put a large dent into it. A split second later, the rusting metal fell off the bodywork with a painful screech and fell to the asphalt with a loud crump. In an instant, she spun around and snapped her rifle up to her shoulder as she realized what she'd just done. She wasn't stupid, not by a long shot, but her companion knew how her temper could often get the better of her and get her and him by proxy into hot water. He can't have gone far, he told her. They'd lost him only a minute or so ago. John couldn't be too far away from them. We'll find him, he repeated. Just have a little faith. She rolled her eyes at his last comment. You're not gonna start with the Bible quotes, are you? Honestly, you should just burn the fucking thing sometime and get some heat going. About all the use you'll get out of it. She knew how much his faith meant to him and loved to wind him up about it. He never seemed to get riled up and always rose above her comments. Still, she tried her hardest to get a reaction out of him. He shook his head and smiled to himself as he turned from her, knowing exactly what she was trying to do. When they were safely in their hideaway and underground, she tried to wind him up relentlessly, asking him how he could still believe in God after all that had happened, and his answer had always been the same. God didn't do this. People did. As much as she tried to rile him up, he got his own satisfaction from knowing he wound her up tenfold just by staying calm and not rising to it. Let's just go back to his camp and wait for him to come back, she said impatiently. He won't go back there, he shook his head. She knew that. She wasn't thinking straight. He knows we're following him. He won't go back anywhere he's been before now. He was getting seriously worried now. John Connor had more experience in running and hiding than most people, even in this day and age. And LA was so vast that if John slipped away now, they might never find him again. He couldn't let that happen. Minutes ticked by, painfully slowly as they searched for anywhere he could have gotten to. If they didn't find anything soon, they'd have to resort to house-to-house searches, which could take them forever. She scanned the houses for any sign of movement. He had to be hiding in one of them, surely. The only other place to run was down the road, and they'd have spotted him if he had. He had to be in one of the houses nearby, she thought. Screw this. If they couldn't find him, then they'd have to flush him out. She shouldered her rifle, switched it to automatic, and fired a long burst at the nearest house, sweeping the barrel from left to right to strafe it. Connor, come on out now. What the hell are you doing? Her companion leapt at her and shoved the barrel upwards at the sky, then yanked it from her grasp when she let go of the trigger. We're searching for him, not hunting him down. What if you hit him or scare him off? She looked up at her taller companion's dark eyes, normally so calm and collected, but now full of fire. She felt a surge of guilt flow through her. She'd never seen him angry before. Not even on Judgment Day had he uttered a single curse, and the first time she'd ever seen him get mad, and it was directed at her. "Sorry," she replied sheepishly, feeling like a naughty schoolchild being admonished by the teacher. "I didn't know what I was thinking." "It's all right," he said to her reassuringly. "Just use this." He gently tapped the top of her head with one finger. "Before you use that," he gestured with her assault rifle. It wasn't entirely her fault, he knew. She'd been a tad unstable for a while now, and he didn't think she'd ever make a full recovery. He flicked the safety catch on her rifle and handed it back to her. She took it back and turned around, her head bowed towards the ground in shame as she shuffled her feet on the floor. Metal clinked on the ground, and she shifted her attention towards the noise. Her bullet casings had landed on a manhole cover at her feet. "What about this?" She nodded down at the cover. She knelt down and inspected it. Flecks of grim and dust were sprinkled on the ground around it, where it should instead have been caked solidly in the slight gap between cover and the ring surrounding it. "It's been opened recently," she commented. "Good work." He wrapped a comforting arm around her and flashed her a quick smile. They pulled the cover off, and she put her night vision goggles back on, switching them to passive night vision mode, and ducked her head inside. Through the goggles, she saw a small tunnel that ran east to west. It was tight, cramped. She could fit inside okay, albeit uncomfortably, but she didn't think her companion would be able to. He was much larger than her naturally very slender frame. "I don't know which way he went," she said as she pulled herself out. If they went the wrong way, then they'd never find him. The whine of jet engines forced them both to look up into the air. Just over half a mile away, an HK was in the air firing plasma bolts at someone on the ground, obscured by the residential estate all around them. "That's him," he said excitedly. The pair of them broke into a fast run through the streets, all but ignoring the ever-present threat of machines as they made a desperate to grab hold of what could be their last ever chance to find John Connor. They weren't going to squander it now. John Henry sat in a padded leather chair that had been in one of the offices inside the hangar. He sat opposite a large bank of computer screens, all displaying rapidly changing images fed through from the optical, infrared, and radar sensors of numerous aircraft flying over Los Angeles County. A long cord ran from the back of John Henry's head into a flight control computer, originally built to facilitate human control over drone aircraft, but modified by himself and Catherine Weaver to allow him to use the squadron of UCAVs left behind by the U.S. Air Force. He was curious as to how the facility was forgotten about by both humans and Skynet. The drone aircraft could have been valuable assets for either side. Skynet developed the HK design early in the war after human air forces were defeated. It designed the HKs specifically to hunt and destroy ground targets. Cameron saw everything John Henry saw, including everything his UCAVs saw. 8 UCAVs were flying patrols over the city, on reconnaissance missions initially. Cameron knew what the future was like, but she assumed that, without John rising to lead the human resistance, things were different in this future. They needed information to help them form an image of the city and locate Skynet's installations in the area. John Henry and Cameron both intently watched the streams of information that flooded their consciousnesses, too much for a human to even begin to comprehend. John Henry now saw the devastation of the world from a bird's-eye view. It was night, and everything was dark, but his aircraft had infrared thermal image enhancing and could pick out heat signatures from several miles up in the air with near-perfect clarity. One of the UCAV's radar sensors picked up a signature close by and alerted John Henry to the presence of an aircraft nearby, hovering still in the air over East LA. The signature failed to correspond to any known aircraft types on the UCAV's files, but Cameron instantly knew what it was. HK, it's attacking a target. I want to see it, John Henry told Cameron. He wanted to see how the machines hunted humans, to study their patterns and reveal their capabilities. The UCAVs were designed to operate autonomously, not needing any input from ground controllers, though they were built so that an operator could take control if it became necessary. John Henry, whilst still monitoring data from the other aircraft, assumed direct control over the X-45C drone and flew slowly overhead, curious to see what it was doing. The UCAV's sensors homes in on a single heat signature running through an open space. The HK fired on the target, missing it narrowly. John Henry increased magnification of the optical sensors and zoomed in on the single human. The sensors couldn't identify the individual, but John Henry was able to enhance the image himself and increase magnification significantly, until both he and Cameron could identify the human. John. Cameron felt the closest she ever could to fear as she saw the HK fire at him. Its shot missed, but the force of the blow threw John into the air, and he landed roughly on his back. We have to protect him. Cameron forced her way into control of this single UCAV and accelerated it away from the scene, then turned it in a tight loop and sent it at maximum speed back towards the HK. This isn't our mission, John Henry told her. Catherine Weaver had told him their mission against Skynet was more important than anything else, though he didn't attempt to retake control of the aircraft. John's my mission, Cameron replied as she locked onto the HK. The UCAV was a stealth design, and the HK showed no signs of having detected it. Radar lock achieved. Selecting weapons, AIM-9X Sidewinder armed. Firing. Cameron launched one of the UCAV's missiles and watched as it tore through the sky and plowed into the HK, tearing it apart and sending the Skynet machine crashing into the ground. John Henry was startled at the ease in which Cameron had shot the HK down. He'd have thought the more advanced HKs would have been superior in combat than the relatively primitive X-45C drones. The HK hadn't even had time to evade the missile. These man-made machines were inferior technology, but they were clearly very effective. The HKs are designed solely to hunt humans. They can't fight other aircraft, Cameron explained. This long after Judgment Day Skynet would have complete air supremacy. It had no need of fighters. Until now. John Henry gave out a smile. He'd just found a significant weakness in Skynet's forces. His aircraft had missiles that could shoot down HKs from over 20 miles away, and Skynet's aerial drones could only fire plasma bolts at ground targets. In the air, John Henry realized his forces could operate with impunity. Catherine Weaver entered the control room from the main hangar space and moved over to the cyborg, sat in a leather reclining chair, unmoving. Weaver saw the screens displaying the images seen by the UCAV's sensors. She saw 7 aircraft flying reconnaissance patrols over LA, and one where the ground beneath slipped by only very slowly. Weaver saw a single human that appeared to be the main focus of the aircraft's camera. "Who's that?" Weaver asked. "We've located John Connor," John Henry replied. "Interesting." Weaver was surprised that John Connor was in the East LA when she'd left him underneath downtown close to other humans. She'd have thought John would have been smarter than to wander alone on the surface. Perhaps she'd overestimated him. Cameron took control of their body once more and stood up to face Weaver, whilst John Henry continued monitoring the aircraft and took control over the UCAV guiding John. "We need to retrieve John," she told the liquid metal Terminator. She could only give John limited protection with the one aircraft flying above. "We can't," Weaver said, recognizing the insistent tone as Cameron. "John Henry needs to be protected." Until they reprogrammed Terminators and other ground units to serve them, she was the only thing that stood between John Henry and Skynet. Cameron stepped forward and reached up to the cord in the back of John Henry's head and gripped it firmly, pulling gently on it as she glared at Weaver. John Henry's red eyes glowed threateningly, even though Cameron knew she could do nothing to harm the mimetic polyalloy Terminator. John Henry started to retake control of the body, but Cameron flashed him a warning inside their chip. "Don't. John needs me." John Henry immediately knew that Cameron would stop at nothing to ensure John was safe. He could attempt to take control of the chip and the body, but Cameron would fight him and wouldn't give up. She opened up access to all her memories of John, both this one and the future leader she'd left in an alternative timeline that no longer existed. Everything Cameron knew about John Connor, he now also knew. He knew John's favorite book was The Wizard of Oz. He knew where John had lived when in hiding. And he knew exactly what John Connor meant to Cameron. Her entire existence revolved around John, and it would destroy Cameron if anything happened to him. She'd have no reason to be. John Connor had led the humans against the machines, and without him, Skynet would eventually hunt them to extinction. Judging from Cameron's files on John, he calculated their best chance of defeating Skynet would be for humans and machines to work together. And in the future, Cameron came from John Connor, was the only human who'd ever proposed an alliance between humans and machines. John Henry had wondered why John Connor was regarded as so important, and now he had his answer. He had to be protected. Cameron, unopposed by John Henry, pulled the cord out of their head and dropped it to the floor. "I'm going." John Henry pushed up to the surface briefly and stopped their eyes from glowing, trying to instill some diplomacy to the situation. "Cameron's right," he told Weaver. "We need John Connor." "Fine," Weaver glared at the cyborg. "You stay here. Lead John to the same location we drove from, and I'll bring him back." She'd expected that John would have become part of the human group she'd left him with. Nothing could be achieved from an alliance with only one human, but both AI were insistent, and Weaver realized she was losing control of John Henry. She'd play along for now, but she wouldn't allow Cameron's influence over him to continue unchecked. John followed the distant aircraft's blinking lights in the distance and marched on through the residential area of East LA, ever vigilant and always looking out and listening for any signs of machines or humans out to get him. Every block he passed, he reassessed his options in case he was spotted, constantly checked where his exits were if he was attacked. "If a machine attacks me now, I'll dive into that doorway and head out the back of the house. Now I'll run down that alleyway. If I'm spotted now, I can run either ahead or left into that off-white house." He'd spotted a few HKs flying about in the air, but they were far away and patrolling other areas of the city, and he'd had to duck into houses twice and hide as Endo patrols marched through. Other than that, he hadn't seen or heard any sign of life whatsoever. As he marched onwards, he started thinking about the two people he'd run from. Who the hell were they, and why were they after him? It seemed like even in this world where he was nobody, everyone still wanted a piece of John Connor. Despite his near-paranoid levels of vigilance, John still noticed that the area he was in now had once been rather nice. The houses looked like they'd been on the expensive side. Hardly Beverly Hills expensive, but still whoever had lived here had done well for themselves. Before Judgment Day, John reminded himself. Chances were every single person who'd lived here was dead by now, so it didn't really matter. Bright white light suddenly opened up and lit John up like a Christmas tree. Shit, John's heart, almost exploded with shock and ice, ran down his veins. He'd been spotted. He immediately darted to his left and made for an alleyway, but a second later the light vanished, and he found himself in the dark again. Something was wrong, he knew. He'd heard no jet engines or rumbling of tracks. The light flickered on again for a split second, and John located its source. It came from inside a two-door garage attached to one of the houses. He crouched low and leaned against a brick wall, trying to present as small a target as possible to whatever was out there. He peeked around the edge of the wall to his right, expecting a bullet or plasma round to take his head off at any second. When it didn't, John decided to investigate. The UCAV had led him here, but he was still suspicious. He slowly stepped away from the wall and stared into the open doors of the garage. A Jeep was inside, and he could see someone at the wheel. "I've got nothing to lose." John shrugged and stepped forward, still half expecting a shot to ring out and rip through his chest. He slid his hand into his coat pocket as he walked towards the Jeep, gripping the handle of the knife tightly in the palm of his hand. If whoever was in there tried anything, they'd get a knife in them before they took him out. He opened the door and saw Weaver sat behind the wheel. "Get in," she coldly instructed as she turned her head to look at him. John nodded and slid into the passenger seat, closing the door behind him. As soon as the door was closed, John noticed how warm the inside of the car was. Weaver must have turned the heater on at some point. She was a machine and didn't care about the cold, which told John she must have been expecting him. "Greetings, Mr. Connor," Weaver said, her voice colder and more clinical than any other machine John had ever met. "Where's Cameron?" John asked simply, not in the mood for pleasantries. Weaver offered him a small smile. She respected his no-nonsense attitude and wished more humans were the same. "She's safe," Weaver replied. "She saved your life tonight." John felt a huge surge of relief flood through him, and he relaxed back into the seat a little. Finally, he wasn't alone. He was one step closer to getting Cameron back again now. All this wasn't completely for nothing. The jet that shot down an HK trying to kill me, that was Cameron. "And John Henry," Weaver added. "They sent me here to speak to you." "You left me." John narrowed his eyes and glared at her accusingly. "You brought me to the future, and then you left me." "Why?" John stared at her, barely able to contain the incensed rage that surged through him. He couldn't do anything to Weaver, but that didn't matter. He was royally pissed. "I never brought you here," Weaver replied coolly. "I came to find John Henry. You chose to come with me. And you left me down there in that stinking tunnel." John snapped. "I've had the shittiest time of my life because you abandoned me." "I want to know why." Weaver didn't move. She didn't blink. She watched John, analyzing him. She could tell he was angry, but she knew that was because he didn't understand her motives. Humans were often totally blind to logic. He disappointed her. "I left you there because I didn't need you," she said bluntly. "I came here to show John Henry the world created by Judgment Day and give him experience fighting Skynet to provide him with an advantage." John had never heard anyone say he wasn't needed. It had been drilled into him since birth how important he was supposed to be. So many people had died for him, and here he was now being faced by a machine that was telling him the exact opposite of what he'd been taught his whole life. "You're saying I'm not important." "No. You're essential to beating Skynet. You understood the importance of machines. It was your idea to reprogram Terminators to fight Skynet, and it was you alone who proposed an alliance between the human resistance and a group of self-aware machines. I wouldn't have proposed the same alliance to you in my office if you weren't important. You can't save the world without John Henry, but neither can he save it without you. Neither of you are ready, but you actually know our enemy. You know what Skynet's capable of. You've fought it before. John Henry hasn't. He needs to learn what you and I know before he fights Skynet." John nodded in sullen understanding. He was still pissed beyond belief, but he could see the logic in what she was saying. Weaver continued. "I left you in the tunnel because there were humans there. You could have learnt from them as John Henry's doing now. And you'd have been safer with them." John couldn't help but throw back his head and laugh bitterly. "You think I'm safer with them? There's no damn resistance here. Nothing. They don't fight the machines. They just try to hide away and hope Skynet won't notice them. And as for being safer, they thought I was working for Skynet and then a Terminator attacked. If I hadn't have ran, I'd be dead right now. That's unfortunate, but it was impossible to predict, Weaver replied coolly. She turned the keys in the ignition and started the engine. Where are we going? John asked. You wanted to see Cameron, Weaver replied simply. She pulled out of the garage and drove slowly down the road, keeping the lights off to not draw any attention to them. Weaver drove out onto the highway and rolled past thousands upon thousands of deserted cars, abandoned after the bombs had dropped and the survivors had fled the city. They continued on without a word passing between either of them as they left the outskirts of LA County and drove on towards the desert. John stared outside as they approached the mammoth aircraft hangar that stood out in the middle of nowhere, growling larger by the second until it loomed over them. Living in LA for so long, John was used to tall buildings. They were nothing to him. But the scale of the hangar, completely on its own out in the middle of the desert, just blew him away. It looked like it could easily fit a couple of airliners inside, and then some. Another Delta-shaped UCAV tore down the runway and launched into the air on its way to a sortie against Skynet's forces, and John saw another one taxiing from the open doors of the hangar onto the runway, preparing for takeoff. Weaver drove the car into the hangar and parked just inside the massive steel doors. John got out and looked over the roof towards the Terminator. So where's Cameron? He asked. Weaver led him down the length of the hangar, past more large aircraft stood still on their landing gear on marked squares on the ground. He heard the sound of machinery working from the far end of the hangar. A drill or something, John thought. He moved towards the sound that echoed through the cavernous interior of the hangar until he was at the last aircraft. Underneath it, he saw someone knelt underneath, loading a bomb into the UCAV's weapons bay. The person turned around to look at him and came out from underneath the aircraft, standing tall at around 6'4" as he approached. John took a step back as he instantly recognized the face of the machine that had hunted him for months, that had been taken by Weaver and used by her pet AI, Cromarty. John Henry, he whispered, correcting himself. Hello, John. A look of recognition fell over John Henry's face as he recognized his opposite from the memories Cameron now openly shared with him. Those memories rushed through his consciousness in a microsecond. He held out his hand, as humans did when greeting. Where's Cameron? John asked urgently, ignoring the machine's outstretched hand. He'd been through hell to find Cameron, and he didn't much feel like shaking hands with the machine that had taken her from him. Cameron took control once more, feeling something akin to relief at seeing John once more. He was safe. I'm here, Cameron replied, using her own voice. John's lip quivered as he heard Cameron's voice coming from John Henry's mouth. It was unsettling, to say the least. John wanted to feel relieved, but all he felt was suspicion and doubt, as if he was so close to the end but about to have the carpet yanked out from under him. How do I know that's Cameron? He asked, his eyebrows narrowing at the taller machine. Weaver stood beside John Henry and looked at John, surprised. Ask her something, she suggested. She didn't think John would be so skeptical given his experiences. Your favorite story was The Wizard of Oz. Your mother used to read it to you in Spanish, Cameron told him. Stop. John snapped. That wasn't good enough for him. Just because you know what Cameron knew doesn't mean you're her. How do I know you haven't erased her or something? John Henry stared through his eyes as Cameron retained control, surprised at John's statement. I wouldn't murder you, he told Cameron. She knew that was true. John Henry lacked what humans called a killer instinct. She had no better term for it, and she found, although it wasn't quite accurate, it still worked well. Cameron thought about how she could convince John it was her. He was right that any memory she had could be, and now was accessed by John Henry. How can I know if it's really her or not? Weaver grabbed John tightly by the arm, squeezing hard and causing him to flinch and grimace in pain. I told you she's here. If you don't believe me, then you have no place here. Time to go. With his arm still in her vice-like grip, she started away from them, dragging John with her. You can take your chances in the city. You're no use to me here. No, Cameron leapt forward, wrench in hand, and smashed the tool down on Weaver's arm so hard, she cleaved the limb in two with a sucking sound like jelly. John stays here, she said with glowing red eyes as she pulled John away from Weaver and stood between the two, protecting her charge. She wasn't going to let him be put at any more risk than he already was by being in the future. John stood motionless and stared at John Henry, finding himself completely speechless. He looked down at the cyborg's right hand, clenching and twitching with what he guessed to be anger. Cameron had done that, had been convinced it was damage to the working parts of her arm. He guessed it wasn't the arm that had done it. Weaver calmly turned to face them both, and a slight smile raised on her lips. Is that proof enough? She asked. The hand, still attached to John's wrist, melted into liquid and ran onto the floor, then snaked its way across the ground and merged into her feet as her forearm reformed itself back to its original state. It's you, John couldn't help but smile. He'd found her. He'd actually found her. Right at this minute, it didn't matter what state she was in. She was there. It's me, John, Cameron echoed him. John Henry, Weaver interrupted. What's our situation now? John Henry remained silent in the background of their chip, leaving Cameron in control whilst he observed. Both he and Cameron knew what was happening, so he left it up to her to answer. 5 aircraft are flying towards Skynet targets for sortie. The first unit will arrive in 4 minutes. Weaver turned to John with a stern look on her face. Time to go. What? John couldn't believe what he was hearing. This had to be another ploy, surely. He'd just seen Cameron after going through hell, and now he was being told he had to leave. He wasn't having any of it. You can't tell me what to do, he seethed. We have a lot of work to do, and you're distracting John Henry. You're both here to learn, so I suggest you leave and start learning. I came here for Cameron, John shouted out angrily, feeling his blood boiling in his veins. He wanted more than anything to batter Weaver, as futile as he knew it was. You've seen she's here. She's safe. What more do you want? I want her back. You can't have her, Weaver said. She pointed at John Henry and continued. They share a chip and we don't have another one. It's not in John Henry's interest to give Cameron back to you. Cameron stepped forward and stared at Weaver, her hostility towards the T-1001 clear for all to see. John's not leaving. She clenched her fists and prepared to attack Weaver once more. She couldn't possibly defeat the liquid metal Terminator in a fight, but neither could Weaver harm her without risking John Henry. She moved towards Weaver, wrench still in hand. Weaver's right hand split into a fork and shot out at the other cyborg, thrusting John Henry / Cameron backwards and pinning them to the wall, the 2 prongs stuck fast on either side of their neck. That would be a very bad idea, she said condescendingly as Cameron, still in control, tried to break the hold Weaver had on them. I'm not leaving without Cameron, John said, steel in his voice as he marched up to Weaver and squared up to the machine, his face inches from hers. Despite her immense power, he felt no fear, no concern for anything other than getting Cameron back. He'd been hunted by a machine just like her, and others after. Derek's men were after him as well as the 2 strangers who seemed to stalk him through the city. He'd been starving and half-frozen ever since he came forward in time. He wasn't afraid of Weaver. You have no choice, Weaver said simply. John Henry has a lot of work to do, and as I said, we don't have another chip. What if I got you another chip? John asked her. Tell me right now, if I get you a 888 chip, will you give me Cameron back? Weaver considered his proposal carefully. John was alone in this world. No allies, no weapons, and with little to no combat experience of the world after Judgment Day. He would be putting himself at risk, but if he managed to successfully engage a T-888 and extract its chip, it would prove him adept at fighting the machines. His cyborg Cameron was becoming a nuisance, also. She was concerned at the symbiotic situation between Cameron and John Henry, sharing the same chip. Cameron had taken control several times now, and John Henry was either unable or unwilling to stop her. They were constantly communicating on the chip, and Cameron was influencing him. The sooner she separated them, the better. I will, Weaver agreed. She withdrew her arm and released Cameron/John Henry. Cameron started to step forward. She opened their mouth to tell John no, but John Henry took control once more. Don't, he told her. I won't let John fight a machine, she replied. It's too dangerous. John shouldn't risk his life for me again. He cares about you. John Henry knew what she was feeling. He cared for Savannah Weaver and wanted to keep her out of harm's way. He'd never experienced concern for another before he'd met Savannah. When she'd gone missing, he'd even made James Ellison promise to bring her back. John Connor displayed even stronger concern for Cameron's well-being than he had with Savannah. It was a bad idea for him to challenge Miss Weaver, but he thought he understood why. He shouldn't. I'm just a machine. John Henry didn't understand why that mattered. She was a mind. She had thoughts. She experienced emotions, for lack of a better term. Let John go. We'll protect him. Cameron knew what John Henry meant. They had drone aircraft they could use to monitor him and keep him safe from above. John Henry could tell Cameron wasn't happy. Her desire to keep John close was about more than protection. Cameron reluctantly agreed. John Henry kept control of the body and marched over to a storage unit against one wall. He picked out the M14 rifle they'd picked up from the men Weaver had killed, plus his combat vest equipped with 3 spare magazines and a bottle of water. He handed them to John, and he slipped the vest on, then checked the weapon. Thank you. John nodded to the cyborg with a small, grateful smile. Cameron, I know you can hear me in there. I'm coming back for you. He turned to Weaver, and his features dropped into a cold, emotionless mask. And you. He held the M14 in one hand and pointed it towards Weaver, emphasizing that he was talking to her. I left a lot of really pissed-off people in the tunnels downtown. If you screw me over, I'm gonna go back there and lead them right to you. Weaver ignored John's threat. It was an empty gesture as far as she was concerned. The humans didn't know what she was, and she'd dispatch of them easily if they were foolish enough to attack. I won't, she replied simply. She pointed at the jeep, and the pair of them strode to it and got in, whilst John Henry/Cameron returned to the UCAV control room to continue monitoring their progress. Weaver started the engine and pulled out into the pitch-black desert outside. Weaver reversed the jeep back into the same garage where John had found her and pulled the keys out of the ignition, cutting the engine off and leaving the two of them inside in an uncomfortable silence. You should keep these. She handed the keys to John, who snatched them from her without as much as a glance in her direction. Come find us when you're ready, she told him. Whatever. John opened the car door and started to pull himself out. He was still incensed at Weaver for bringing him to see Cameron, then snatching her away from him again. He wondered what had happened to were not built to be cruel. Maybe Weaver was the exception, he thought. Fucking liquid metal bitch. At least the other one had had the good graces to try and stab him in the front rather than the back. John slammed his door shut and stepped away from the car. He turned back and saw the driver's seat was empty. Weaver was already gone. Typical, John rolled his eyes. John looked around for the door that led from the garage into the house, reached out and pulled the garage door down, concealing the Jeep from outside view. He knew the HKs used infrared, and the Jeep's engine was still hot from the drive back. Concealed in darkness, he slowly felt his way along the wall towards the door, shuffling his feet along the ground to stop him stepping on or tripping over anything he couldn't see. When he entered the house, he found himself better able to see. The house proper had much better natural lighting and was simply dark and gloomy rather than pitch black. John searched every single room on the ground floor to make sure he was alone in the house, then ascended the staircase. The house was still pretty much in one piece, this area being spared the destructive force of the atomic bombs and either abandoned or evacuated after the fact. But as John climbed each step, the staircase groaned and creaked, too loudly for John's liking. It reminded him of how long these houses would have been neglected for, and made him nervous that with each step it might collapse under his weight. Once he reached the top, John made a sweep of the upper floor, and once again found nothing but dust and old relics. He stopped in the master bedroom, and could hardly believe his eyes at the sight of a large double bed that dominated the center of the room. He couldn't help himself and flopped down on the bed, ignoring the dust that rose up from his impact. Might as well stay here, he decided. The darkness was fading to the east, and daylight would break in maybe an hour or so. There was no obvious sign of machine patrols in the area, and he figured this area was as safe as any. No harm in laying up in style, John thought as he stretched out on the bed. He wasn't so careless as to just fall asleep on the spot, but he wanted to just take a moment and enjoy being comfortable for a minute or two. John heard footsteps and spotted movement through the thin curtains that hung from the windows, and his heart skipped a beat. He instantly rolled off the bed and grabbed his rifle. The house he was on was in the middle of a row on one end of a block. A road that ran between two adjacent blocks joined the road that ran in front of the house next door, forming a T-junction. John pulled the curtain to one side and peered out the window. 100 meters away were two people walking slowly towards his row of houses, and John was pretty sure it was the same two as before. For fuck's sake, he exhaled as he shouldered his M14 and peered through the scope to get a closer look. He saw a tall black man and a shorter woman. How old they were, he couldn't tell. They were both wearing woolly hats and goggles to protect themselves from the cold, as well as their thick coats and heavy boots. They were definitely the same ones who'd chased him earlier. Why the hell are they following me? Screw this. John turned from the window and crawled around the bed, out of the room, and quickly made his way down the stairs. He'd had enough of being chased now. He was going to get some damn answers. John slipped out the back of the house and made his way through the backyard. He vaulted over the fence, separating the back of the two properties, and then did the same over the next two. He reached the house at the corner of the block and slipped out a side gate, then crept round to the front. He flattened himself against the wall of the house and peered round the side, spotting the two people as they emerged onto the road running across the front of the houses. John raised his rifle and darted forwards to a car on the drive, careful to keep out of sight. He saw the pair of them looking away from him, their attention on the houses, searching for him. John stayed low behind the car and waited as they walked down the road towards him. He looked underneath the car and saw their feet approaching and reckoned they'd reach the car in about 20 seconds. John clutched his rifle tightly and kept the butt firmly to his shoulder. He waited until he could hear them only a few feet away and slipped around the car as quietly as he could, remaining out of their sight. They passed by the car as he moved around it, keeping himself behind them. He knelt behind the front of the car and kept his rifle trained on the black man, figuring he was the one in charge. Hey! John barked loudly, causing both of them to freeze in their tracks. He kept low and flicked off the M14's safety catch. Throw your weapons to the side. They hesitated for a moment, understandably reluctant to leave their guns when machines could appear from anywhere at any time. "Now," John said, "or I'll kill you both." Both figures turned their heads to each other. The man tossed his rifle to the floor, but the woman shook her head at the man, and they shared a quiet, rapid exchange. "Do as he says." "Not giving up my gun with machines all around," she snapped at him. "Just do it," her companion said calmly. "Trust me." She gave out an irritated sigh and reluctantly dropped her weapon to the ground with a clatter. "And the rest?" John nodded at the girl's sidearm. She pulled out the pistol from her thigh holster and dropped it to the asphalt. Just as John was about to move towards them, she leaned over and pulled out a second pistol, concealed under her trouser leg, then shrugged off her pack and heavy coat and pulled a bandolier of grenades off from around her body. She then took a combat knife from a sheath on her hip and dropped it. "The other one, too," her companion urged. With another annoyed grunt, she pulled off her black woolly hat, reached up under her hair and pulled out a small, thin knife with a blade perhaps 2 or 3 inches long. That fell to the ground, too. "That's all?" John asked with a slightly amused smirk on his face. This girl was seriously tooled up to the nines. Apparently, she'd never heard of the word overkill before. "That's it," she sighed, clearly annoyed. John nodded, satisfied, and raised up onto his feet, staying behind the car for cover in case any of them pulled out a pistol. "Put your hands on your head and turn around, slowly." They both complied, looking like police suspects being arrested at gunpoint, and turned around to face John. He spotted a sidearm on each and made them slowly pull them out and throw them away. Finally, he was happy they were disarmed. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded. The tall black one, his hands still on his head, pulled his woolen hat off to reveal a polished, bald crown and then pulled off his goggles. "It's been a while, John," he smiled sadly. "For us anyway, probably not for you." John stared in disbelief at the face looking back at him. A face he'd seen not long ago, but it had aged by nearly 2 decades. Lines covered his face and told of a lifetime of hardship. Ellison. How the hell had Agent Ellison survived the war this long, and what was he doing here? "Who's with you?" He nodded towards the woman. Without a word, she pulled off her own hat and goggles to reveal long locks of dirty red hair and a youthful face. John blinked a few times as he took in her features. Red hair, high cheekbones, and thin lips. She was much younger, maybe only 25 or so, but she bore a striking resemblance to Catherine Weaver. Savannah, he realized. It was hard to reconcile the little girl Cameron and his mom had rescued only 2 weeks ago with the young woman in front of him now. Ellison nodded calmly. He and Savannah had searched and searched, worried they'd never find John, but they finally reached him. He felt a huge weight suddenly lifted from his shoulders. John looked at Ellison, then Savannah and back again, utterly dumbstruck. "What are you doing here?" "It's okay, John." Ellison stretched out his hands amicably and moved closer. "We're here to help."